Welcome, everyone. It's great to see a full house for this seminar. I'm here to introduce the speaker. I'm Yadvinder Mali. I'm director of our Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery at Oxford and Professor of Ecosystem Science in the Geography department. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, but a couple of things beforehand. Firstly, both the talk and the Q&A afterwards will be recorded and live streamed, so be aware of that. If you're asking questions overall. And afterwards at 6:15, we have drinks next door, just on the right in the coffee area, and you're all welcome to have a more informal chat over a drink afterwards. So Erle Ellis is with us on and off for a year as a visiting Martin Fellow at our Leverhulme Centre. So do use this chance over this year to interact with him further if you wish. I'll also mention that he's giving a seminar next Friday after next in geography on anthromes. So if you want to have more of Erle, do come along to that one event. He's a professor of geography and environment at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Apparently those last two words are important in that description. And he has, I've come across his work for a long time before I actually met Erle. He's been a leading thinker on the Anthropocene, on our understanding of human relations with the planet, not only now and in the future, but also over all of human history and the history of agriculture and land use over the last 10, 12,000 years. And he's very vocal. He's often a critic of many of the prevailing ideas around the Anthropocene and the planetary boundaries, and I'm sure we'll hear some of those thoughts in his talk. And he has a book, one of those more short introduction series that you often see in bookshops, the Anthropocene, a short introduction. So Erle is the author of that book, which is a nice overview of the issues around the Anthropocene. Thanks very much, Erle, and over to you.
All right, well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Yadvinder, for the fine introduction and for hosting me here. And thank you, Martin School, for this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about what I've been thinking about for the past year or so. The title is a little weird for me, Unleashing Things. I don't usually use that terminology. Another thing I've been saying about this talk to kind of explain what's this talk about is human development is often presented as a sense the problem for the environment. What if it was actually the solution to some of our environmental challenges? So that's how I'm going to frame my talk. We're going to talk about the Anthropocene, this human age in which people are transforming the planet, not just as a crisis, but as an opportunity to take advantage of some of the processes that have shaped this world in many ways for the worse, can also shape this planet for the better. And how can we engage with these aspirations to have a better future for people in a way that makes a better future for the planet. And finally, to kind of bring this to a actionable framework, we're going to talk about how can we take these aspirations for a better future and connect them with the processes of human development that are already shaping this planet. So the kinds of narratives we're getting used to hearing about the environment are like this one, the sixth mass extinction. So it's not completely an untrue narrative. If people kept causing extinctions at current rates of acceleration for hundreds of years, we could potentially get to the point where half of species went extinct. That would take centuries. We are not anywhere near this situation now. It doesn't mean that there's something good going on here with extinction rates. Our extinction rates are way too high and we have to stop this. But the idea that we have already entered a mass extinction is incorrect. We have a lot to do to avoid this. And this is another example of what I would consider to be actually one of the best produced understandings of the limits and targets for a better future. This idea that we should avoid the planet heating over 1.5 degrees, okay? And what's so good about this is ultimately the fact that this is not actually a scientifically defined number. A lot of people think it is. This number is really defined by a political agreement among most of the nations of the world. That's what makes it a useful number. It's an agreement to do something together. That kind of cooperation is what makes us good. But there's a problem here. So I think most of you know that at least for this year, it's very likely we will be in the 1.5 degree world. And this model of how we should think about the 1.5 degree world is a lot like this. It's beyond our capacity to adapt. Okay, and we're going to be in this 1.5 plus degrees world for years and years, probably for decades. There's no way out of being more than 1.5 degrees. This is the world we're going to live in. And so we're going to have this message every day that we have passed the safe zone. We're now only in this zone where societies can't adapt. Okay, so this is going to cause a loss of faith in the organizations that created this message to some degree, right? Because they have failed to protect us from 1.5 degrees. So it's just kind of the blowback that you can get from this kind of crisis narrative of passing boundaries. There's a lot of research showing that when you use a crisis narrative, it tends to cause division. It doesn't necessarily bring people together. There are cases where it does, but many cases where it is the opposite effect. It creates division. We have a lot of division right now in the world about solutions to these things. And why am I showing you this? The Inflation Reduction Act. Why would I show you this? This has nothing to do with climate, except that it is the very largest investment the United States has ever made. In fact, it's one of the largest investments ever made in the world to deal with climate change. And how are they sending this message? They are not saying it's a crisis of climate change. They are saying this is an opportunity to have a better world, which means better conditions for people. This is something that people will get on board with, and that's how we have one of the biggest investments in a better future, not from the crisis narrative, but by connecting to people what they really care about. That brings people together. So here we are in this human age, the Anthropocene. And I use this illustration, even though you've all seen this a million times, right? The planet now glows at night. This is the planet that glows at night. This never happened before human beings were on the planet, right? This is completely a human-caused effect. And a few simple questions about this effect. Okay, you can see this if you were looking with a telescope from another planet. You could see that the planet now glows at night. It's a physical phenomena. But can you understand it using physics? No. Is it because there's so many people on Earth? Just there's so many people. That's why the planet glows. No, it has nothing to do with how many people are here. It has everything to do with what we've cooperated together to do to set up the infrastructure to light up the Earth. But did anyone want to light up the Earth? No. It's completely an unintended consequence, right? Of just making other plans, just doing what we're doing, having a little lighting around our houses, because this is outdoor lighting. That's why the planet is glowing at night. Unintended consequences. Is anyone really trying to cause global climate change? No. It's a side effect of trying to do something else. So that's very important to understand the Anthropocene. That's most of the transformation of the planet that we have done. It's not intended. It's unintended consequences. And then another simple question. All right, so this is caused by humans, right? So let's turn it off. Let's turn off the lights. Is it even possible? No, there is no control room on planet Earth. There's no cockpit where you can turn the dials on how the planet operates. This is purely an emergent phenomena of all of us interacting together, again, unintentionally producing this phenomenon. It's a really big challenge in this human world to do things collectively, to do things that we decide to do together. That is the challenge of the Anthropocene. How much agency can we deliver to make the future not just what happens accidentally, but intentionally? So this is a better way to think about the Anthropocene than a crisis. All right, we are in this entanglement. When we do this, nature moves. When nature moves, it moves us. We are in this web of entanglements with the planet, and we cannot leave this entanglement. There is no solution to an entanglement. There's merely navigating the entanglement in better ways. That's about all we have open to us. So don't think that there's this kind of future where we can just somehow roll back the clock and we won't have to worry about nature anymore or the planet. Everything we do is going to influence the planet. So the only options we really have in entanglement is to do better with what we have. We can't leave it. And unfortunately, the reality is there's no panacea. there's no way to end this relationship that we have created with 8 billion people on the planet and all of our technologies and the way that we live. We are going to change the planet. The only question is how. In what way are we going to change the planet? Can we change it for the better rather than just the ways that we're creating it for the worse? That is the challenge of the Anthropocene. And there really is no simple solution, and there's no turning back the clock. There's no reversing. There's no getting out of the entanglement. So the Anthropocene is indeed a crisis, right? We are doing things with negative consequences that we want to address. We want to stop these things, right? We don't want to deforest Amazonia, right? This would be a really bad thing. But the idea that people deforesting Amazonia is this brand new phenomena really isn't correct. It's not actually the situation that we're in. When a lot of these areas get deforested, one of the first things that's discovered is that, in fact, people were there before. And this is a 900-year-old earthwork called a geoglyph. It is not a building foundation. It's a symbolic earthwork of earlier people in these places. So there's a much deeper history to human transformation of ecology. The idea that extinctions are these things that modern industrial societies do, it's not incorrect, but it's something that people have contributed to extinctions before. Thousands of years ago, before we even had agriculture, people were having an influence. We have thousands of years of transforming this planet. In fact, if you look back 12,000 years ago, the best estimates we have are that about 3/4 of Earth's land surface was inhabited and shaped by those people who lived there 12,000 years ago. So there's nothing new about shaping the planet. Now, we have shaped the planet much faster, much more over time, but the idea that this is somehow a new concept, that people never influenced the planet before, is incorrect. Even climate change has a long history. You hear now about agriculture can influence climate change. Well, yeah, there's nothing new about agriculture, is there? And in fact, estimates made with models, now these are not, high precision things, but there's a lot of evidence that people, through agriculture and other forms of land clearing, influenced global climate as much as 0.7 degrees over thousands of years. Now, that's a completely different thing than what we're doing today, right? Industrial emissions is like a Formula One race car, and this is like a slow train. So very different kind of rates. But still, people have been transforming the planet one way or another, shaping evolution, shaping the atmosphere, shaping Earth's soil, shaping ecology for thousands of years. It's nothing new. This is the first law of the Anthropocene. We live on a planet whose ecology, the relations among organisms, people, and the abiotic environment, these are entangled, they are interrelated, and people have been shaping them for thousands of years. And it's not going to end. This is going to be the truth in 100 years, 1,000 years from now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a theory that tries to explain why do people make such a big transformative difference? Okay, there's plenty of organisms out there. Why is there this one species that has gotten into this situation where it is transforming the entire planet? You're seeing some fancy words here that you've probably never seen before. If you really want to get the details here, there's some papers. I have one coming out that's pretty good on this. The citation down there can help you more. But I'll try to walk you through the basic idea here. Okay, this is the classic view of ecology. It's pretty much obsolete now, but a lot of people were trained this way at least. And the idea of evolution and how life has changed over time in terms of its genetic inheritances, right, the evolution of life, is that biotic organisms have to adapt to their environment. This is an example of the abiotic environment, right? Organisms have to adapt. That's what they do. Okay, so the environment is basically just shaping the genetics, shaping the evolution of the organism. Right? That's a pretty simple model of evolution, right? But it's not good enough to explain a lot of the realities in ecology. And this is a simple example that everyone can identify with, right? The beavers change their environment. Beavers shape their environment. And this shaping is actually required for their reproduction. They don't reproduce until they built one of these dams and built a structure that they can live in. And so that's ecosystem engineering is the technical term for that. And when this engineering of the environment to improve reproductive success, in other words, influencing their own ability to reproduce, evolutionary consequences, that is called the process of niche construction. And the consequence is called an ecological inheritance. We talked about genetic inheritance. Now we have an ecological inheritance, shaping the environment to improve the future outcomes of that organism and the population of the species. So that makes a more complicated understanding of evolution. Two-way street. Now, the beaver is not the only species that alters its environment in ways that it must adapt to. So a two-way street, right? Organism is adapting to the environment. It's also shaping the environment. It's adapting to the shaped environment, and back and forth. A much more complicated view of evolution. There's a lot of species that do this, not unique to people, right? Bacteria even do it. They put things into their environment to make an outcome different. Another thing we need to understand, all right, so social learning, which is also called cultural inheritance, okay, the movement of essentially learning from others and passing on knowledge. That is not unique to humans at all either. There's so many species that have culture, and this is an example of a songbird that must learn its reproductive song, its mating song from others in the environment. It's not born with this ability, and once it's learned that, then it can reproduce. So that's obviously a pretty important type of culture for this individual to learn. Okay, so that's cultural inheritance. And sociality. Are we the first social species? I think all of you know that's not true, right? There's lots of social species. I actually learned the exact number. It's, well, the approximate number is about 13,000 species of social insects, okay? But there's a few things to know about all these other social insects and most social species, is if you ask the question, okay, how many individuals are in the society of this species? It's very easy to say, because it's genetic, right? This is a kind of genetic form of sociality, and all the individuals in a social group or society of social insects are highly related to each other, okay? They're like cousins. You know all that, right? Like ants, they reproduce with one queen, for example. They're all related. Okay, that's eusociality. That's the form of sociality we've seen that can be very intense, right? These organisms can't live without each other. They feed each other. They do a lot of these things. But people take it one step farther. Human sociality is a little different, okay? How many people can live in a human society? How big can it be? There's no answer, right? People can live in very small groups and tribes. People can live in very large groups, so like we do now, and people in this room are living in very large-scale societies, all right? So human sociality is actually pretty different, pretty exceptional, and that is called ultrasociality. And in that, we have a lot of different aspects, but one of the important ones is this idea that we talked about what defines the sociality of a social insect. It is genetics. What defines the sociality of a human society? Culture. We have to learn to be social. The way that we're social is learned. That gives us complete flexibility. The way we can live with each other, the kinds of societies we can form, can evolve through culture very quickly, very completely. And we can all very quickly learn things. Right now you are doing this, right? We are exchanging culture very quickly, much faster than evolution can act on, say, genetics, right? A very fast way of social learning. All right, so we're gonna put those things together. We talked about niche construction, right? Shaping the environment that sustains us, right? Where did your food come from today? Most of it came from an environment that has been shaped, engineered to produce food for people, right? So that's the niche construction. That niche was constructed through cooperation. It was constructed socially, right? Many people are involved. In fact, part of the niche is that you didn't even go to the farm, did you? The food came from a store, and you interacted with somebody who had no relationship, maybe, with where the food came from. So there's a social relationship. And then the cultural part, right? You need to learn how to produce food in these things. So it's socio-cultural niche construction. That is the process that's exceptional about the way that people have learned to live on Earth. And it's exceptional in general. And it keeps evolving. Sociocultural niche construction is not just about the engineering of environments. It's also very much about the way that food and other resources flow through a society, the way that we interact with each other in ways that sustain us. Over the very long time, over many thousands of years, and I interrupt this message because it looks very much like, okay, there's a direction to evolution. Don't get that idea. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying there are some patterns in the evolution of sociocultural niche construction that do tend to show up after each other, okay? But this is not saying that one society will do that, okay? But the bottom line is, if you look at societal scales, right, the largest scale societies that have ever existed are the recent ones. And some of the earliest forms are smaller, okay? But these two are going to be really central to what I'm going to talk about. So niche construction intensity. There's this idea that a lot of people have, is that somehow people who live in the industrial world use more land per person than people did, say, 1,000 years ago. That's incorrect. Okay, 1,000 years ago, the amount of land that it took to produce food for one person was much greater. And it was transformed in a different way too. So if we look at the far left there, we're talking about hunter-gatherer society. So the transformation of the environment exists. Hunter-gatherers don't just have no effects on their environment. They manage their environments in many different ways, or at least shape their environments. And the bottom line is, it takes a lot of these less shaped environments to sustain one person in one of these societies. Once people learn to do some of the practices that enhance the productivity of the environment, could be burning to open up the landscape, or even agriculture comes in, as we know, right? It's much more productive per person, per unit land area than hunting and gathering is. You have less land per person, but the land that you're using to sustain people is more transformed. Okay, so we're using less land per person over time, and we're transforming it more. So that's a long-term pattern in the way we're transforming this planet. The other one is that we use more energy. And the first form of energy that gets used by people that is really exceptional is the use of fire. And the use of fire to cook food might seem like it has no big consequences, but in fact it does. It substitutes a lot of energy that you would have to use to digest the food of your own biological energy, and it makes that much more efficient. So you're actually substituting biological energy that you would have to use using fire. And we have certainly continued to do that more and more. And as you see, the more intensively managed landscapes in the larger scale societies also tend to use a lot more energy substitution, right? You're using biomass. It's all been biomass for a lot of history. That could be animal traction, a lot of other forms of biomass energy. Obviously, wood forests are coming back now that you're not burning so much wood, and you burned fossil carbon, fossil biomass. That was a period. And now we're learning to use energy directly from the abiotic environment. Rather than just use biomass or fossilized biomass, we're using energy directly from the sun. We're using energy directly from the wind. We're using nuclear energy. We have forms of energy that are not from the biosphere, and we're bringing them into our society. So that is another long-term trend. Again, I just don't want anyone to think that there's this linear kind of progress concept here. That's not what I'm trying to get at. The realities of evolution are always producing lots of diversity. Hunter-gatherer societies are just as functional, just as productive, just as adapted as they ever were. It just means that there's lots of possibilities being created by evolution. Just to talk about land use intensification, again, I mentioned it. This is something that's well studied, well understood, is that there's a tendency as demand for the products of land, that's mostly food in most societies, increases, as the demand increases, the efficiency with which that food production goes on goes up, and there's less land use. This is often called agricultural intensification. You can actually see this in hunter-gatherer societies before agriculture, but in a sense, as demand increases, the amount of land used to feed one person goes down. The efficiency of production goes up. So land use intensification is one big trend. Another big driver of this long-term change in scale is that there's some benefits to living in larger scale societies, especially in the densest parts of larger scale societies. So even in ancient societies, this was true. If you lived in a larger scale settlement, you'd have more access to economic opportunities. It's, of course, very true today. As you know, right, the big cities tend to have more economic opportunities, more connections that enable people to get ahead, and that's why we see the biggest effects of transformative change on the planet today are largely driven by urbanization. And in a place like the UK, right, most urbanization has already occurred a long time ago, but in large parts of the world, this is an ongoing process. We've passed half of all human beings now live in cities, and that trend is continuing, okay? And it's because of this drive to take advantage of these densely populated large-scale societies. This is reshaping the planet, urbanization. But the biggest effects of urbanization occur outside the city, okay? The kinds of systems that support densely populated, wealthy urban centers are intensive, large-scale producers. Most of the production that feeds everybody on this planet is coming out of large-scale intensive agriculture. You may not like it, but it is a fact. That's where most of your calories are coming from, et cetera. So these things are coupled together over time. You might think, okay, this is just bad news, and I sometimes show a slide that says the best way to fix a problem is with a larger problem, and that may have some truth. But if you look here, these are some trends that we see today, right? And that actually are some of the things that actually could lead to a better future. And one, of course, is the demographic transition. So what happens to people who live in cities? They have smaller families. They do this intentionally. They'd rather have smaller families. So that is changing the kinds of dynamics of population on this planet. Population is leveling off. That's what's happening. That is the reality. You don't even have to do anything. It's going to happen. Okay, it's already happening. But even more interesting is that over the period in which we saw the huge population growth, the last 50 years or so, there's been huge amounts of population growth. Total number of people in the population has gone from like 3 billion to like 8. That's a huge change. But look at what happened to food supply. All during this time, there's more food calories produced per person, not just total, per person. Okay, it doesn't mean everyone's eating well, because when we talk about food systems, right, it's not just food production that matters, it's how people are getting access to the food. But is there enough food to feed everyone? Unquestionably there is. More and more better quality food is available on this planet per person than there was in the past. So that's a good thing. And the other thing is that's even more interesting is that the total amount of agricultural land has not increased significantly in the past 25, 30 years. That may seem strange, but what's really happening is a combination of two things. So this is total agriculture, not just intensive cropped agriculture. So intensive cropped agriculture has increased as a fraction of this. But the other thing that's happened is it's moved around the world. So whereas one point there was intensive agriculture going on right around here, feeding people with, say, wheat, and now that wheat production might be somewhere in Canada or somewhere else. It's moved away, or might be in the tropics. That's why we see some of these situations of rapid deforestation in the tropics. It's moved around. But the bottom line is at planetary scale, we haven't really increased the total amount of land that is used for agriculture. And at the same time, as the intensification of agriculture has occurred, and UK is a good example, right? There's more forests in the UK than there were, believe it or not. And it's especially true in places like the United States. There's huge forests have regrown as agriculture has become more intensive. I saw this also in China. We're going to talk a fair amount about China, which is a place I have a lot of experience since the 1990s. Okay, in 1990, there was less tree cover than there is now. Okay, so even in a population that's continued to grow a lot, you see a remarkable recovery. So these big trends in human societies, in some ways they come down to development, human development. Okay, opportunities that make people's lives better. This is just some examples of the Human Development Index increasing over time. We're going to talk about development in a minute. But it gets at the second law of the Anthropocene. Okay, this planet has changed incredibly in the last 50 years. How did it do that? It's because people wanted a better life, and they've more or less made that happen. People live a lot longer than they used to live. More people have a decent income than they used to have. More people have education access than they used to have. Things have gotten a lot better for most people. Not everybody. There's places that are still need a lot of work. But the bottom line is, aspiring to live a better life has really reshaped this planet. It is a force of nature. Now we have a planet that is the most transformed, the largest societies ever, largest scales, the most capable of using energy, the most interconnected, the most interdependent, the most capable societies that have ever existed on Earth. That's what we have now. That is our situation. What are we going to do with these capable societies, okay? Obviously, there's a lot of problems, but the idea that we live in a society where we can't accomplish the changes for the better is absurd. There's never been more capability to transform the planet for the better than there is now. All right, so that sounds a little magical thinking, right? How do we tap into that? I mean, it's not a simple thing, okay? It does sound a little simple, but remember, I started off saying no panaceas. We're not going to get out of this situation. The question is, how can we get the agency that we need to shape the Earth for the better? So let's start talking about development a little bit. So human development has really characterizing the improvements to human societies over the last many decades, okay, or even centuries. All right, and so people in the human development world talk about creating an environment for people where they can develop to their full potential. And 3 indicators are used to say like whether lives are improving or not in, say, a place or a time. And that might be a long and healthy life. That's an aspiration, to have a longer and healthy life. Are lives actually getting longer and healthier? Okay, you can measure that. How are we doing with knowledge or access to education? And how are people doing with standard of living? We can assess this. We can see, are these aspirations for a better future for people being met That means something to be able to assess this progress and guide toward the progress. But I want to ask simple questions. When they say create an environment, what kind of environment are they talking about? Is this a natural environment? Unfortunately not. Pretty much, just like a lot of people out there, there's this narrative that human development does what it does, and the best thing that human development could do is just not destroy nature. Okay, and that was actually literally all the relationship with nature that was discussed when people talked about human development. Human development must progress without destroying nature. That's too low a bar. That is not the right message. It is not the way to think about human development. Human development is about creating a better world. It's not about avoiding destruction. It's about creating a better world. So things are changing with the concepts of human development in aspirations for what does a better future even mean. And here's an example, right? The United Nations now has just a few months ago, has now ratified a human right to a clean and healthy environment. So that's interesting, okay? So the UN has defined this as something that we should aspire to, right? Everyone should have access to these things. And I think that's a good thing. That's a good move in the right direction. So the question I asked at the beginning, right, is can we take these aspirations that we have for a better future, and can we harness them to actually shape a better future for the rest of nature? We've been very good at shaping a better future for people. Believe it or not, a lot of people don't want to admit this, but things have gotten a lot better for people. This planet has been reshaped to make things better for people. What about the rest of nature? What's happening with that? And so I'm going to talk about this concept that this is what we can focus on. This could be the aspiration that could lead to harnessing aspirations to shape a better planet for the rest of nature. And then I'll talk a little bit about could we assess this. So a lot of people have this idea that people just destroy nature, okay? If there's no people there, nature's good. You put a person there, it starts to become a problem. More people, more problem. Simple relationship, right? You can only have a footprint on nature. That's just not correct. That is not scientifically correct. If you want to go to a biodiverse, amazing place, you want to see the big five, right? You want to go see the best examples of megafauna still alive on this planet. You don't go to a place without people. You go to the Masai Mara or some place like that. And people have lived there for a very long time. And these people are actually, the Masai, are herders. They're pastoralists. This is a pastoral land that they use. And it is about as diverse as you're going to get for megafauna anywhere. So this is basically a protected place, protected by them. If you want to understand the diversity of landscapes in Amazonia, some of the most diverse, productive landscapes are those that are shaped by indigenous people. And the idea that just leaving things alone and letting it get old is going to make more diversity, more productivity is not correct, okay? You create different levels of succession through burning places, using places, then moving around actually creates more diversity. Burning, and this is a good example of where ecologists have really failed the hardest, I would say, is with the idea that the best thing you can do is suppress fire, because fire destroys ecosystems. There was this idea for a long time that that's what you should do with fire. Fire just destroys ecosystems. In fact, fire needs to be part of ecosystems. There's a lot of ecosystems, no fire, no reproduction of many species, and you build up the kinds of fuel that can cause a mega fire, a fire that would never occur when indigenous people like the Martu are burning low-frequency fires all the time, all year long, and maintaining a low fuel load and a much more biodiverse, more heterogeneous landscape with lots more opportunities for biodiversity. In fact, it's been shown that bringing back these practices increases biodiversity. Bringing back people is important for biodiversity. It's not that simple. I told you I spent time in China. So in 1990, lived in Beijing, very gray city. And, spring finally came, and I'm sitting in the park, and it's getting green in the park, and so I'm starting to feel better about it. And I start to hear the birds singing in the trees, and I feel even better. And then I turn around, and all the birds in the park were in cages. They were pet birds. And this was about as good as it got back in 1990. China was still a very poor country in 1990. It was a completely different place. And this was about as much of an aspiration you could have to interact with nature. It was a very different kind of culture of nature. For example, I visited Sichuan, Chengdu, the home of the giant panda, and there were signs up. I never saw this, but there were signs up that said you could see a panda riding a motorcycle back in 1990. That was cool in 1990. It's not cool anymore. Things have changed completely with the relationship to nature in China. So this is not just a guy abusing pandas. This is the biggest supporter of panda conservation in the world. He's a Chinese, very wealthy individual. And this is what people aspire to for a panda now. They won't want a panda on a motorcycle. They want a wild panda living free. This is a representative of kind of people's aspirations for nature. They're completely different now that China is a much wealthier place. And people are willing to do the very strange things that it takes to have wild pandas, like this guy wearing a panda suit covered in panda urine, so that he smells like a panda, and he can release this panda to the wild, and it will not be acculturated to people. So you can actually have a wild panda. People will do what it takes to have wild nature under certain conditions. Is this just talk? Is just like, okay, it's cool, they have panda suits? No, China has completely changed its game on conservation. Simple as that. Now, there's been a lot of pollution. There's been a lot of challenges in China. There's still a lot of challenges in China. But is China changed its game with conservation? 100%. Yes, huge changes. It's for real. Okay, development has changed things. Okay, even here in Europe, okay, a species that has probably the worst reputation at all in Europe, the wolf, is coming back. Maybe it'll even come back to the UK. It'll depend completely on your aspirations for nature, completely. If you guys want the wolf back, if you're willing to live with the wolf, which is not easy, it's not easy to live with the wolf. You have to give up something for it. You have to give back something. But if you want the wolf, it can come back. It's come back to all over Europe. There's a lot of aspirations now. People are thinking bigger about what is possible. Can we recover a lot of nature? And there's a lot of aspirations for a better future for nature. And these aspirations, well, this is a kind of an old concept, the idea of a Kuznets curve, this idea of not a direction, right? We're not just more people, more economics, more destruction, this idea that, well, there's a kind of a period of more and more transformation and use of nature that kind of lends to, after some kind of turning point, you might enter into this different relationship where you might recover a lot of nature and have nature recovery. And that's through this kind of aspirational nature as we just talked about. People start to want the wolf to come back because it's not the same kind of relationship as it was in the past. There's lots of issues with that. But bottom line is, thinking about the relationship with nature this way. Okay, so we want to have a relationship with nature. What is a healthy relationship with nature? What does that even mean? Well, I'm borrowing here from the psychology of human relationships a little bit. And there's this idea of a pyramid of a healthy relationship. And the basis for a healthy relationship, before you even start talking about it, is it must be a safe relationship. Are you making nature safe? Is nature safe from you? That's a really important question that you need to ask yourself, okay? That's important. We can't go forward without providing safety for the rest of nature. Respect, and this one, so important, reciprocity. Okay, we're really good at taking. How good can we be at giving back? Can we aspire to having a healthy relationship with nature where nature is safe and healthy? I think we can. Now, how do we do this? It's non-trivial to do this. Again, I'm not going to talk about panaceas here, but it's still important. You have to get into the game. You have to care, and you have to work on your relationship if you want to have a better relationship. So we're going to talk about nature's contributions to people, right? That one part of the relationship, right? Nature contributes a lot to us. We'll talk about that, but then we'll talk about the harder part. The part I think is the big challenge. The challenge we want to address is, can we contribute to nature? How well can we do that part of the relation? Can we give back? Can we be reciprocal in our relationship? Okay, so nature's contributions to people. It's not hard to catalog those, right? You eat 3 times a day, probably. That's one contribution. There's a lot of contributions. We use nature to sustain us. We can gain some benefits by access to nature. And even just connecting to nature can be good for us. Okay, so here's an example of getting something from nature. All this stuff came from nature. Now, one thing to notice here, right, is any of the kind of part of nature that actually produce these things accessible here? No, right? So this is one of the challenges, is that we're really good at taking, but we don't take directly. None of you are going out there and killing your own animals to eat or something like that. You're not foraging your own food anymore. There's a kind of disconnect. So we're really good at taking things, but we're not even noticing where they're coming from. It's very hard. You can't really be blamed for not knowing where everything in the supermarket comes from. How could you even know? Even the person who runs the supermarket doesn't know. It's really complicated. This is really a huge challenge, is this extinction of experience, this kind of barrier between us and the rest of the world that we've created, not intentionally. Nobody wanted this barrier to exist. It just is created because everything comes from nature through our society. It doesn't come directly anymore. That's part of what happens with a larger scale society, is you're no longer directly interacting with nature. Other people do that for you. You don't even know who those people are. That's really a challenge. There's a lot of evidence that stuff like just being out in some green space can really improve your health. Okay, so accessibility to nature, that's something that we can also get. Something we can get from nature. So it's a thing we can do. We can shape environments, and most people live in the city now. We can shape environments that are better for people because they have some interactions with nature that can make us healthier, for example. Right? So that's a good thing, right? Something about the relationship between nature giving us something, giving us some health. Well, okay, can nature do everything for us? Is that going to work out? Unfortunately, no. And the idea that we're going to solve global climate change using nature to absorb carbon emissions from our industrial operations is absurd. Okay, nature doesn't exist to take up industrial carbon emissions. Okay, but a lot of people are trying to do that. Ultimately, if we're going to be good in this relationship with nature, we need to take responsibility. It's about taking responsibility. Have you ever heard of that in relationships? You got to take responsibility for your stuff. It's important. It's fundamental. You're not going to get far if you don't take responsibility for what's yours. That industrial pollution is ours. It's not nature's problem, okay? And when we do take responsibility, we do solve these planetary problems. We did that with CFCs. Believe it or not, the producing nations, not everybody, the producing nations said, we're going to phase them out. Okay, there's a complicated history there, but that really is what happened. Okay, there eventually were agreements with all the countries in the world, but the leaders, the ones who took responsibility, were the developed countries who were producing CFCs. Not everybody was producing them. And when they took responsibility, they succeeded in ending most of the harmful CFC production, and the ozone hole is going away. It's an example of that. When you take responsibility, when those who are producing these problems take responsibility, we can solve these things. And they were forced to take responsibility too. People expected them to do that. Okay? All right, so let's go to the other side, people's contributions to nature. What can we do to be better partners in our relationship with nature? Well, first of all, obviously safety first, right? We just talked about that. Is nature safe from us? Can we make nature safe? So I think that's pretty important. Obviously, taking responsibility for our pollution, especially our carbon pollution, because that's changing everything. Okay, the carbon pollution needs to be taken responsibility for in the human world. But what about this? Is there enough space for the rest of nature? Do other species have enough room? Do you even know? It's hard to know. Right? This is a hard thing, but that's what we're talking about here. We want to make nature safe. Are we caring for the rest of the species? So one model for this, kind of making space for nature, is the kind of nature without people model, and it's not useless. Nature doesn't, other organisms don't always want to live with us. It's fine to have lots of spaces, and there is an effort, less successful than it needs to be, to protect areas and create conservation space so that there's habitats for other species to live in, not just us. But there is a challenge here, okay? About 80% of the planet is covered by landscapes that are either intensively or kind of in a lower intensity used to sustain people. So most of the nature conservation can't be just done in these kind of places far from people. So the idea that you can give space to nature far away and that's going to be good enough, it's not true. There's not enough room left that's far away from people. It's all in the human world. So really when we talk about giving back and making space for the rest of nature, we really need to think about creating that space. A lot of times you have to recover it. You have to plant it. You have to make it. And you have to make room for it with policies and other strategies to bring those things back. Living in the human world, trying to make habitat and our infrastructure, agriculture, other kinds, work together. It sounds good, like, oh, we'll just do some conservation and some ag in the same place, it'll be all good. That's synergy. But a huge amount of it is like this, right? This is how you get killed by a deer. Okay, a deer can't normally kill you, But when you build this kind of infrastructure, right, where the deer don't have anywhere to go, if they need to get to where they need to go, they have to go through our roads. Yeah, they will kill you, and of course they die in the process. Nothing good. This is kind of a lose-lose. But we're not stupid. We are very capable. We are capable of solving problems. And this is an example of solving the problem. And this is an old slide of actually a design. Now this is actually creating movement space for the rest of life to go about its business without getting hit by our vehicles, is a standard for building highways. And when things become a standard, you don't even have to have a protest. You don't need to go out there and make a big stir every time you want to fix things. It just becomes the way that you interact with nature. The way you build a highway has to have space for other species to move. It's part of the design of the human world. That's the kind of thing we need to move toward. And believe it or not, there is a lot of resources available for this when people really care. This is an example of mountain lion. I don't know if you know this. There are a few mountain lions that live in the city, inside the city of Los Angeles. There's a great article about that in the New Yorker. I recommend it highly. Okay, the hard part is how do these individuals find each other to breed? Very hard. They have to move through the human world. It's dangerous. They have to cross highways. And this one was actually, I think this is the one that did get killed on the highway. Many people were very disturbed about this. The bottom line is there's others, and they have built a new highway overpass just for a handful of these things. Just a handful of these lions are getting a bridge that costs millions of dollars. So when people really care, they can change these things. When we can assess these kinds of things, the care, the space that is made for the rest of nature. This is not something that is beyond our ability to see how we're doing. We can assess this. Just like we can assess not just how much carbon is in the atmosphere or what the temperature is of the planet. We can assess how much carbon is being emitted per person, okay? And take responsibility for that. Take responsibility for the carbon emissions per person, not the temperature of the planet. That's not the problem. The problem is people aren't taking responsibility. The people who are emitting it, the richest people in the world who are emitting that carbon need to take responsibility. That is the solution, not 1.5 degrees. Finally, can we put this together into human development? Another pillar, right? We've got these three types of aspirations about what makes the human world better. A healthy nature relationship makes the world better for you. You are going to live better. You are going to be a happier person. The whole world is going to be better for you when you aspire and actually achieve a better relationship with nature. It is something we should care about. It is something we should all think about, and it's something we should all try to achieve. And maybe we can even do what we do with the regular Human Development Index and try to have an index that looks at how different countries are doing with their carbon emissions per person, for example, and take that as part of the process of creating this better world for people. And I'd just like to thank some of the people who have inspired this conversation, this concept of a healthy human relationship to nature. These are folks who were involved in the UN Human Development Report Office workshop this summer. And I just want to finish with a couple concepts. The one that is based from the most recent science and has become a more and more popular concept for a lot of people, is the idea that you're not 100% human, right? We're about 80, 90% human, right? The rest of us is all the microbes and other creatures that live in us and live on us. We are not disconnected from the rest of nature. We are actually part. We are fully connected. We are sitting here in this room. We are exchanging microbes, like it or not. Okay, that is just the way the world is. We are not disconnected. You can imagine that we are, but we're not. We are actually not just a human being. We are part of the rest of nature. And that the most important thing of all about a better relationship with nature is it makes us better people. It makes us better in our relationships with each other. And that includes things like teaching each other about the rest of nature. That's a really important thing. Do your children know the names of the other creatures that live around them so they can have a relationship with these creatures, right? Do you have a relationship with people you don't know the name of? A little bit, but it's better when you know these names. We can recover a lot of this connection. This is something we are capable of. We live in the most capable societies in history. It's time to think about how we're going to have a healthier relationship with nature. Thank you.
Thank Thank you, Will. Well, a lot to unpack there. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. We'll also take some from online as well. But we'll kick off with some in-person questions. Anybody want to kick off? Back? Just wait for the microphone, just to...
Thank you very much for the lecture. So I was wondering, if we were politicians sitting here, would you change any of your narrative that you told?
No.
And do you think it would work?
Yes.
Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, let me say why. Because politicians care about what their constituencies care about. That's what makes them act. That doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in a democracy or even in a country that's run by just a few people. They have to get along with the people that they are basically involved with. And if those people demand things of them, they have to deal with that. And so creating this kind of demand for a healthy relationship with nature is the kind of thing that will influence politics. That's my perspective on this.
Okay.
Obviously, though, if the planet is heating up extremely, surely that is going to have an effect on all of life on Earth.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, right, the planet heating up is one of the greatest problems for the rest of nature that exists. But is it a problem of the planet being too hot? Is it a problem that there's too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? No. This is a problem of the richest people in the world, right? When I say that, I mean like probably the richest quarter, not taking responsibility for the emissions from their fossil fuel combustion. And that can end. But the pressure should be on them, not on, how to deal with 1.5 degrees or how to plant more trees. That is not the solution here. The solution here is responsibility for these emissions.
Okay, take one from the back somewhere. So keep your hands up for people asking questions over there. Straight ahead on the left. Yep.
This one?
Further up. Just,
Sorry.
Thanks so much. Well, a challenge, if I may. I specialize in communications. What I'm hearing for you sounds like, thank you for the first person who asked this, like a narrative. And with a narrative, there's a real danger of a kind of a confirmation bias, of cherry-picking examples which look good, because the overall picture, as we know, doesn't look good at all. And I guess maybe the challenge to you is also that this is an elite narrative, that talking about opportunities out of crises is exactly the kind of language which we hear from elite entrepreneurs, from people who are already very powerful in business. Even the language of the Anthropocene itself is kind of whitewashing over the criminality of one group of people through their actions impoverishing another group by talking about the commonality of humanity. So I'm just interested to hear your response to that challenge.
Well, it's absolutely correct that what I've been talking about here is a narrative. Absolutely. And narratives do shape thinking. They do have power in a sense, at least if they're widely shared and they're popular. But I have to say that the narrative right now about a lot of these things is to say, let the science speak, and these other kinds of things that actually provide a barrier between those creating the problems and the solutions to these problems. So, as I said, taking responsibility is the narrative, I think, about this relationship that really needs to change. I think that this whole idea that we can talk about climate change as a problem of temperature, as a problem of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, these other kinds of planetary evidence, is just whitewashing the fact that what's really the problem is that we know the solution is to stop burning fossil fuels, which requires, of course, energy coming from other sources that don't produce carbon emissions, right? And that is not the focus. The idea that we can plant trees to solve the climate problem is exactly that kind of narrative that diffuses responsibility away from the simple fact that it's about burning fossil fuels. It's all about burning fossil fuels. That's by far the most important thing that needs to happen, is we need to transition off of energy systems, other systems that use fossil fuels. That has to end. And those responsible is not everybody. It's not a human problem. It's a problem of those people that are doing it. I'm guilty of that. Absolutely, right? I take airplanes, I do all sorts of things that use the carbon, but the goal is that isn't the way that we do what we do. We have to stop emitting fossil fuels. And those responsible are the ones who should take action. It's not a problem for everyone in the world. It will be a problem for them in terms of climate changing, but they're not responsible for this problem of carbon emissions.
I'll take one from online now. This is from Garth. I'll slightly rephrase it. How do you deal with malign agents in the world? Are you assuming, well, we know that there are malign agents. You say that nobody wants a worse relationship with the planet, but maybe some people want other people to have a worse relationship with the planet for their own good. So how do you frame, so say, selfish and greedy organizations or governments in this framing?
Okay, so who's at fault with all these things, right? Is it just these bad actors who intentionally want to harm people? There's companies that just want to increase the carbon dioxide concentration of the atmosphere. Is that true? No, they want to make lots of money. That's basically what's going on here. And it can be made difficult to make lots of money by emitting fossil fuels. And it can also be made easier to make money by doing other ways of generating energy, transportation, or other services that people want. So the idea that it's just about these bad guys with bad purses. Now, it's true that the vested interests in burning fossil fuel are huge. Basically, the entire economies of the developed world have been built around burning fossil fuels. And the vested interests that have produced that energy that's powered the modern world, right, they have a lot to lose. Leaving it in the ground is going to cost them fortunes. So they will do what it takes to fight back against their interests. That is true. So nothing's going to come without a struggle. I'm not trying to say that, it's all about easy things. We all just, get along, give along, right? It's no problem. All I'm saying is that we have to point at what is the problem and who is going to take responsibility. And it should be those people actually producing the problem. It's not a problem for humanity. It's a problem for those producing the problem. That is what I'm focused on. The people who are the bad actors in the relationship.
Okay, I'll take a few more from the audience. One here.
Hi, I don't know how long.
Wait for the microphone.
Hi, Carolina Manhusen Schwab. I don't know how long you've been in the UK, but how do you feel the current UK government is taking responsibility in this scenario?
You see me laughing. Unfortunately, yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert on the UK politics, and they are complicated and dynamic, just like the US in a way, except maybe even more complicated and dynamic. But yeah, what it does appear to have happened, right, is that essentially, for political reasons, one actor has been able to have a big effect on what's going on. I think there's going to be blowback. I don't think that this claim that we don't need to do these things is going to work out well in the long term. But I don't know. Politics is politics. It's complicated. There's nothing going to happen without a struggle. If people don't get out and push back on this, yeah, he's going to take that as a win, and he's not going to act. Right? He's only going to act if he gets pushback on environment. And I think that's just the way it's going to be. There's not going to be a world where you just let the politicians handle it. They need to be handled. They need to get the pressure on them to act. And apparently, there's a problem right now.
If I sort of add on top, I think there seems to be the way that's being framed is that there's a conflict between a healthy environment and well-being of the constituents, the motorist or the poor that they're arguing there. So I reckon trying to have a narrative that isn't about opposites there, I think, is part of your theme is there, I think.
Yeah,
is about
it's not a Manichaean world.
Yeah. Okay, well, lots of hands there. Let's take yours there. So.
Just looking at one of your last slides, the one that had the sort of three aspirations of, I guess, pillars of development, was life expectancy, years of education, and GNI, an aggregate of incomes. I mean, if you look at those three, you see that each of them is tied to the idea of the individual, right? Sort of construct of liberal political philosophy. So it's, an individual's years of life expectancy, individual's years of education, the aggregate of individual incomes, and then you have relationship with nature. It's less clear how that relates to an individual in a way that can be measured. So I don't know if you have some thoughts on that, maybe future lines of research.
That is an excellent question and very important. Now, on the one hand, like you're saying, right, people can identify with these things because they are things that a person can have, right? You can have a better relationship with nature too, just like you could have a better education, you could live longer. These are things you could aspire to. But in reality, right, the Human Development Index is not used for individuals. We don't say like you're more developed than him or whatever, right? We do this for nations for the most part. It's usually done at that level. So it's a kind of aggregate success in aspiring to these things. So you notice I didn't say how much carbon dioxide is emitted by countries. It's about how much per capita is emitted, right? So it's very important to tie these things to individual responsibility at the scale of nations. It's a good point.
So the lack of nature culture in human societies, I feel, as you mentioned, definitely has a profound impact on the disconnect between humans and nature. So do you have any suggestions to help promote like more culture in societies involving nature? Because, I mean, from my personal experience, a lot of people in urban societies just, they completely fear nature because they don't understand it and they're not like raised around it, so.
Leave it to my daughter to ask the hardest question. So I don't have a simple answer. I can say some of the things that have made a difference in improving people's ability to have a relationship with nature. Like if you don't even see the other person, if you can't see them as important to you, as something, or another identity that matters to you, then you're not even in a relationship, right? You're just on your own. And that has happened to a lot of people. I think it's become very easy to imagine yourself not even connected to nature. Now that's never true. You always have a relationship with nature. It's impossible not to have a relationship with nature. You're not even 100% human to begin with, and the idea that you are not affecting the planet by what you eat and what you do, or that you can't interact with nature in some other way, you are in that relationship, but you may not see it. And it's easy not to see it because everything can be done for you, and maybe the most comfortable thing you can do is sit inside your house and have, Amazon bring things to your house, and you don't have to go out and get things. You don't have to interact. You can, and that's a trend that we see with development. That's the most disturbing thing of all, is that as people are meeting these aspirations for, say, a long and healthy life, they're not necessarily outside more. They're usually not outside less. These things are correlated. And so how do you reverse a trend like that? That is a challenge. Now, I showed you that slide of the Kutznet curve, right, where things can go in another direction. They can go in one direction, and then they can go in another direction. That is something that we do see. And so how do you do that? Well, I think education is one of the most fundamental things. So do your children know the names of all the species around them? Do they spend time outside as part of their education? Is that baked into the way, what it means to be educated? I think that's pretty fundamental. But there's a lot of, I think it is the really big challenge of all. Because if people don't even see what's going on outside, they're not likely to feel that they need to do something to improve their relationships with the rest of nature. So I think it's one of the most important parts of the nature relationship is improving this relationship, making people more aware that they have this relationship.
Okay, I'll pitch in a question using my chair's privilege. You argue in your talk that we need to move away from the crisis narrative because it isn't effective. We need a more positive vision, something I broadly agree with. But is there still some role for the crisis narrative? Is there a danger that a very rosy, positive vision of flourishing with the natural world perhaps leads to some sort of Panglossian optimism that gets away from the urgency and the crisis of the present? And we still, perhaps, is there a need to both have this positive agency but also have a sense of the urgency of our times?
Yeah, well, I think yes and no. It depends on how it's done. And so what makes a crisis narrative disempower people? Typically what it is, and unfortunately we're going to live through one right now with the 1.5 degrees narrative of crisis, is that we're not going to be able to resolve this crisis in a short time. All right? So we can treat the idea of climate change as something we can solve now, but that's not correct. We cannot end climate change quickly. It's going to take a generation or more. And it's going to be a struggle that's going to have to continue. So telling people that we have 10 years to solve the problem before we get to 1.5 degrees is not the truth, and people will realize it. I've realized it after being told that we have 10 more years for about 30 years. It doesn't actually come true, for one thing. People are not telling the truth, right? We still have another 10 years and things get worse and worse, right? So it's more important, I think, to focus on what we can actually do. What can we actually do? How can we do better? That is a more actionable thing, and it brings up the idea that you actually can make a difference. Whereas a narrative of something that you can't change 1.5 degrees. You can't do anything about that. It is beyond your control, right? What is in your control? What can you actually do? That's a good focus. And that doesn't mean necessarily like, okay, that means that you have to be a vegetarian, right? It's not just as simple as like, okay, you take personal responsibility for the fossil fuel companies. No, it's not like that. But taking responsibility for your relationship with the fossil fuel companies, yeah, they have to know that you don't want that. You want something clean. You don't want something with emissions. You want energy that is clean. This kind of demands on politicians, on the whole system that you live in is what will change the ship. Will steer a little differently. But the idea that we're going to just suddenly enter into a world without climate change is unrealistic, depressing, because it can't be achieved. We have to be serious about the realities that we're in. We are in an entanglement, and it's going to take a long time before we can steer the ship away from the worst futures that we could have had. We already have done that, though. It is also important to recognize, right? Are we still living in the worst possible future? No. If you look at the worst possible futures of 25 years ago, as I have and a lot of climate scientists have done, there's have been a big change in the curves that were expected 30 years ago, largely because of turning the curve on a lot of the energy systems are changing rapidly in the right direction. It's not fast enough. It's not good enough to keep us from having a transgression of 1.5 degrees. We're past 1.5 degrees. You're going to spend the next 10 to 20 years in a world of post 1.5 degrees. Get used to that. But that doesn't mean we're game over. It means game on, right? We have to do better. And it's not about 1.5 degrees. It's about ending the emissions from fossil fuels through a replacement with clean energy.
Okay, I'll take some questions towards the back there, as it says.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was just curious when listening to you talking about, like these potential changes that we see and the various timescales that you just mentioned in your last answer. Do you really think any of this is possible within our current neoliberal capitalist system that really advocates for a grow or die mindset? Do you think that we need to have those changes in our economic and political systems? And if so, where do you think the impetus for those things will come from?
All right, so yeah, that's a question. It's a good question. I've had that question before. So I guess I'm going to ask a question back, first of all. Do you think that neoliberal capitalism, whatever it actually is, right? Isn't all capitalism kind of neoliberal? But the bottom line is, is that going to end? Are you going to extricate yourself from capitalism? And is that necessary for you to have a better future? If it is, then you won't have one. Because capitalism isn't just going to go away to die tomorrow. Okay, this is a very powerful part of our world that actually does a lot of good, believe it or not. It does a lot of harm too, absolutely does. But the idea that there's this simple solution is like, let's get rid of capitalism, is a kind of, I would say, degrading of the real problem. The real challenges are not as simple as like getting rid of capitalism, which isn't really even possible, I don't think. And I'm not being an apologist for the fact that capitalism can destroy a lot and has destroyed a lot. But it's also something that can be part of what the better future is, not just through kind of like, waving the magic wand in the policy world and saying that we'll have market-based solutions for everything. That doesn't work a lot of the time, right? It requires popular pressure to have policies that change energy systems, for example. But that doesn't mean that one of the most powerful forces getting rid of fossil fuels is green energy being profitable. Like cheap wind is killing fossil fuels. Cheap solar is killing coal. I mean, it's a battle of one system against another to some degree, and promoting the one over the other is something we can do. But it doesn't mean that, the only way is like to have the government, build solar. I don't know if that answers it.
Okay, I have time for one last question over there. Yep, right. We'll wait for the microphone.
I was just curious, what kind of aspirations do you think you could have if you don't feel safe enough from nature? Because the perspective from the Global South, especially from a Global South government, is a little different. You get 1 or 2 natural disasters and you're like, to hell with this, we're building a dam, you're changing a couple things, and if these things need to be happening at the same time as places where you feel a lot safer from nature, what kind of transition to this healthy relationship with nature you're thinking of? I'm guessing it's going to be different, because it's not like you're coming down to an unequal partner. You're trying to come up to someone who's threatening,
I'm so glad you asked that, because, and that was what that curve is about to some degree, right? The challenges of living in poverty, the challenge of living where, your kids are going to die in their first year, those are the challenges you have to deal with first. And the idea that people aren't going to deal with those first is a fantasy. People have priorities. People are not stupid. They know that those basics are what is most fundamental to a good life. And so, yeah, that nature aspiration is important. Although the fact is that in some of these places, right, it's easy to have a relationship with nature because you're right there. And so a lot of the aspects actually show up pretty good in a sense, even though you're right, like people might fear the exposure to nature that in the developed world you don't have. So there's this kind of change in aspirations to some degree, or at least an evolution of priorities in what matters the most. But yeah, the fundamentals of economic development and just human development in general, people aren't going to just put nature first when they don't have safety and long lives and all that. That's the first step.
Okay, great. So I think we'll wrap up. Well, there was a lot there in your talk to think through. Good that we have you for a year to really engage further on many of these themes and develop them further. But also really refreshing to have this energy and a vision for such an aspirational vision, but a clear-eyed but aspirational vision of where we are and where we're heading. So please join me in thanking Erle.